Good morning, everybody. I'll just ask that you take your seats, please. Good morning, everybody, and good morning to everybody that's not in the room today with us but is online. So we're streaming live today's sessions to our online audience. Also today, just to let you know that we've opened up the top as well. There's a couple of people up there already. They're really excited for the day, so that's great, Mel. So good to see you up there. Look, really want to welcome you all again. We had a soft launch last night. This is the big launch where we're going to have the Welcome to Country ceremony and some of our keynotes and our welcome from our RMIT hosts that we're on here today. Look, a couple of quick comments before really getting started. So we really left Brisbane, I think, feeling pretty inspired, pretty hopeful for the future, really launching the centre with some really great conversations and some of the initial research that we had gotten underway. Now we're really in the progress of that research. We really switched from establishing ourselves as a centre, now really heavily into delivery mode with all our various programs of work. And today is a really great opportunity to highlight, learn, interact with those, but also network amongst yourselves in terms of that exchange of knowledge and ideas that we saw really well last night in our session around being ahead of ready. It was really great to see the energy in the room and everybody really engaging with that activity, and that will be really fruitful for us moving forward as well. I also want to acknowledge the NHRA board members in the room here today as well. Many of you will meet them at drinks tonight and over morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea, etc. So Oliver Costello, Sandy White, Doug Smith, Greg Ayres, Kate Vino, and Dominic Hogan-Doran are in the room at the moment, and our chair Ian McKenzie will join us today as well. So for those that haven't met me or were last night, so my name's Andrew Gissing. I'm the CEO of Natural Hazards Research Australia. So I'll MC this morning's session and then we'll get into the main program. Just before we do get started, a few housekeeping matters, but before we do that also, I'd also like to pay my own personal acknowledgement to country. And also say that we're here on the land of the Wurundjeri people, the people of the Kulin Nation. We're guests on Wurundjeri country. Wurundjeri land has been a place of teaching, research and learning for thousands of years, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and any First Nations people with us today. We've also brought the message sticks, which Daniel Ross, who's going to provide our smoking ceremony and our welcome to country, has placed around the leaves there. These sticks were created by Uncle Marcus and presented to the centre at our forum in Brisbane, and we continue to use these in important events and meetings and workshops such as this. They really represent the symbols of shared values, knowledge sharing and safe passage through this sharing process. So just a couple of housekeeping matters. So all sessions today are going to be in this room, so there's no need to move to level 7, but be mindful that you will need to switch between rooms tomorrow for various activities. So we're on floor 5 at the moment, so if you just take the steps that's just to the left of the theatre here, you'll find the bathrooms as well. You can use the stairs and the lift throughout the day. At the conclusion of today's program, we're going to have some networking drinks and nibbles again, so I encourage you all to stick around. Everybody stuck around for a while last night, which was great to see everybody. So we welcome you all to join us again today. So there'll be lots of opportunities today to interact, ask some questions. So again, Slido's the way to do that. You can see the QR code in your program, so scan that and you can access the Slido. We'll also have some roving mics around the room there as well, and the MC will moderate those questions. For those watching the forum online, you have live access to the the sessions here today, and includes the keynotes and the project presentations. And also don't forget to be tweeting and talking about the forum on social media. There's some good conversations going on yesterday, so the hashtag's there in the forum program there as well. So that's it from me for the time being, but I'm going to welcome Daniel Ross onto the stage now to provide our Welcome to Country and smoking ceremony. So thank you, Daniel.
Hello everyone, my name's Daniel Ross and I'm a proud Wurundjeri man. When I got here, they asked did I want to use a lectern. It's like trying to invite people into your home with the front door still closed, and I don't like it, it's a barrier. Well, I'll start from the beginning. I normally get told I've got 5 minutes to do a welcome, but I tell people I need a little bit more time because our story starts at the beginning of time. And Bunju is our creator, the wedge-tailed eagle. And he created everything we see, from the stars in the sky to the roots of the trees in the ground. He taught us how to listen, how to care, when we could take food. And some of those things that he taught us was our season for poor neat, when the wattle blooms. And when the wattle blooms, we pause and we check in on our old people. Last year when the wattle bloomed, we lost Uncle Archie Roach, Uncle Jack Charles, Auntie Margaret Gardner, to name a few. I lit it a bit early because I was trying to smoke you all out without inviting you up. But as much as Poor Neat's a tough season to talk about, it's exciting new beginnings. We see yam daisies coming to flower, tadpoles in ponds. An amazing time. Another was when we could take food. And if you're lucky enough, not so much now in Melbourne because of light pollution, but you can make an emu out on the Milky Way. And when the emu stands up, we could take the food. But Pop tells me you had to run like hell. I've never had the chance to do that. The landscape's changed too much. But when the emu lays down on the horizon, it means the father's nesting and we can't take the eggs anymore. Normally I've got a bit more control on my bowl because there's a breeze and my tarnuk's cut in such a way that the wind helps. But that's okay. As you can see, it's not very hot. I might have put it out completely. But 235 years ago, I'll keep talking while I do this. 235 years ago, life as we knew it would change forever. Is it for better? I'm still undecided. What was home? The MCG, a place of ceremony, song, dance, tandarum, bringing people together, was decimated for a sporting field. Not too far from here, we still have registered places amongst the buildings that we stand in today. We're forced off home, Naarm, to places like Bollumboll and Billabong, and eventually Corrandirk, the mission. At Corrandirk, Uncle Billabulleri negotiated the first treaty with John Batman, 12 axes, a few bags of rice, and a couple of blankets. The Crown ripped it up. We weren't worth that much. I thought they would have been good. I picked them at 5 o'clock this morning. They're not behaving, are they? Uncle Barack holds a special place in my heart. And while you're in Melbourne, if you get a chance to visit the shrine and look towards Carlton, you'll see Uncle Barack's face standing over 30 stories tall, overlooking country still today. Uncle Barack gave my great-grandmother the tribal name, Bullum, white butterfly. I'm not sure if you've paused. There's a lot around at the moment, especially here in Melbourne. Gentle, caring, nurturing. The old people had a way of knowing. I hope I get there one day. I just turned 21. I didn't. Nan went on to be instrumental in the opening of the first health service for Aboriginal people. Gentle, caring, nurturing. What a story. How do the old people know? 1967, we had a referendum and we voted yes. Aboriginal people are human. That's another one that surprises me, to be honest. Some people say 60,000 years, but right here in Victoria, on Gunditj Mara country down near Warrnambool, we have places that have human occupation at over 120,000 years and counting. Not long after the 67 referendum, I started school as a proud little Aboriginal boy, sharing my stories with all my friends. So I thought at school that I'd learnt from my aunties, uncles, my grandfather. Except my first day of school was horrible, traumatic. I was told I wasn't Aboriginal because I was white. I went home broken. I cried. I didn't want to go back to school. What is this place? I had my identity stolen from me again. And my grandfather, a very wise man, he sat me down and he explained to me the reason that I was fair-skinned and my cousins weren't was because I was born in the daytime and they were born at night. But that's how we get through those intergenerational traumas that we're told don't exist by mainstream. But as I grew up and got older, the truth came out. And it was because we didn't know where our families were put. My family was sent to Corrandirk, Lake Tyers, Cumragunja, just to name a few of the places. We've been lucky enough to come back together though, and we now know where our families are. But these are the challenges that we were faced. And even last year in the workplace, I received similar comments. It just shows how far we've come as First Nations, but we've got so much further to go. But it's not how we dwell on those bad things, it's how we listen. At the beginning, I spoke about Bunjil's law and listening and caring for each other and caring for country, which is ultimately what everybody's here doing. We're embracing First Nations knowledge. We saw the fires of 19 and 20 summer decimate a landscape, and it took agencies to go back and say, well, we never had fires so hot on our landscape. Why? And now we're asking First Nations how they cared for country. It's like one of my kids, it's naughty. But how we listen and care to the landscape. I talked about Porneet, checking on our old people, checking on landscapes. We see new beginnings. It's important that we embrace those moving forward. But before I welcome you all to my ancestors' home, my home, I'd like to pay my respects to my elders past and present. But I'd like to pause and pay my respects to all of you and acknowledge your elders past and present also. And to me, I believe it's very important that we do that so we move forward collectively as one for the betterment of everybody on my ancestors' home, my home. Now here's one for everyone before I welcome you. I want to talk about my tarnuk. Now there's some influential people in this room here that can help, but I have to get a permit to take a burl from a tree to conduct ceremony, mostly for people that want me to pay for my permit to take the burl. But it'd be great to be able to use my tarnuk is our traditional name for the burl ceremony bowl. That's about 3 years old too, by the way. It took me about 4 weeks to make it. It's hard as hell, and it works fantastic. In my tarnuk, and hopefully some of you, a lot of you look like you're getting smoked now, which is good. I've got cherry balat, which is our medicine plant, to help with the healing of those stories. I've got leaves from a 300-year-old gum tree off the banks of the Werribee River, about 70 kilometres west from where we are now, which I collected this morning. And I've got the manna-gum leaf, our leaf. Wurundjeri means the grub of the manna-gum. And it's important that they all come together. And as you see, when it amalgamates in the smoke, I'm sharing the knowledge from the old people. I'm sharing the healing of the cherry balat and sharing our stories from the manna-gum with you all. I'd like to welcome you all to my ancestors' home, my home. Woman Jika Wurundjeri Bulak, Yemen Gundibek. In the Wurung language, I said, welcome to the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. Our traditional lands go west to the Werribee River, north to the Great Divide, east to Mount Borbor, and south to Mordialloc Creek. Nun Godjan, thank you. Now, I got told that I wasn't allowed to invite everyone up onto the stage, but I'll go for a walk. Here you go, Russ. Thank you. You're all right. You can start.
Thank you, Daniel, for that very special welcome to country and smoking ceremony. We much appreciate your welcome on your traditional lands. We are also hosted here today by RMIT University, and we are really appreciative of the support that RMIT give to us. Our Melbourne Node office is located just down the road here as well, which is on the RMIT campus. We've invited Professor Calum Drummond to also provide a welcome here to RMIT. So I'll just invite Professor Drummond to come up.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Daniel, for that wonderful welcome to country. I'd also like to pay my respects to the peoples of the Wurung and the Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose lands RMIT conducts its business here in Melbourne, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Natural Hazards Research Forum at our RMIT CBD campus. In 1904, a homesick Dorothy McKellar, who was living in the UK at the time, penned her iconic Australian poem known as My Country. And the second verse of that, of which many of you no doubt would have heard, and most Australians, for most Australians, that poem resonates with them, goes as, I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of ragged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains. I love her far horizons, I love her jewel sea, her beauty and her terror, the wide brown land for me. So as Daniel said, and Daniel related some natural hazards that occurred some time ago, Australia is an environment where natural hazards are inevitable. We have long dry spells, we have droughts which lead to bushfires, we have periods of extensive rainfall where we have floods, and this, to use Dorothy McKellar's term, causes terror in the community when these happen. And given that this is the environment in which we live, it is so important that we have organisations like the Natural Hazards Research Association that helps us deal with the environment. The environment is beautiful, but it's also got a hard edge to it. And I'm so pleased that in Australia we have chosen to set up the natural hazards. I'm just throwing everything away. I'm so pleased that we have set up the Natural Hazards Research Australia Centre. It's in its second year of operation after the launch at this equivalent forum last year. I'm very proud of RMIT's partnership with the Centre, as RMIT sees great value in collaborative research and in research that links into national networks of practitioners and researchers. The RMIT partnership is built on the foundations of earlier research centres where RMIT made contributions to the research programs, including the Bushfire Cooperative Research Centre from 2003 to 2014 that conducted research into the social, environmental and economic impacts of bushfires, and the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre 2013 to 2021, where the research aimed to build a disaster-resilient Australia. Collaboration and partnerships across the sector are key to doing impactful research. And at RMIT we say the conduct of excellent research is necessary but not sufficient. It's actually what you do with that excellent research to benefit others beyond the academic community, whether that's societal, environmental or economic benefit, that is incredibly important for us as an applied university. The theme of this year's forum is Research with Impact, Provoke, Inspire, Challenge, Be Involved. This theme captures why the Centre exists: to be innovative, to collaborate nationally, to do research that has impact where it is most needed. This is especially true in Australia, where recent natural hazards events provide us with many opportunities to call on the science and the research more broadly, the policy development, to help us all do things better. The Natural Hazards Research Forum has become an important event on the annual calendar to address the main research issues in natural hazards science. Thank you everybody for coming and participating in this conference at the RMIT City CBD campus, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here.
Okay, we're into our keynote session now, and it's really great to have the Coordinator General of the National Emergency Management Agency, Brendan Moon, with us today. So I'll welcome Brendan up to the stage now. Brendan's also warmly said that he's happy to take a couple of questions at the end of his presentation as well, so we'll be able to do a quick Q&A. So if you do have any questions, put them on the Slido there, and we will be able to get to those.
Good morning. It is certainly wonderful to be back after having an initial conversation with Natural Hazards Research Australia back in October, when I was quite literally 1 week into my role as the Coordinator General of the National Emergency Management Agency. Some referred to me as a Canberra bureaucrat on L plates, and I think some of my colleagues would probably still refer to me as being on L plates, certainly not having transitioned to provisional driving skills within the Commonwealth. But firstly, can I just also acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people. And as Daniel so eloquently put it, we are here to listen, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and certainly to all of those who join us online as well. We pay our respects, and we also acknowledge the lands upon which you gather. As I said, it was actually 8 months ago, we gathered in Brisbane, and we had a conversation then, having myself just emerged from 10 years with the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, managing and coordinating recovery and reconstruction from very many flooding events, catastrophic bushfires and the like. And we were just in the very, very early stages of recovery from those unbelievably intense and massive floods that were experienced in southern Queensland that saw over 9,000 properties damaged, hundreds of thousands of kilometres of roads, thousands of businesses, primary producers, many communities impacted by that event. And we'd experienced rainfall and flooding that in our lived experience we had not experienced before. It was a subtropical environment, and very few of us had actually experienced 800 or 900 mils of rainfall in one night. And unfortunately that then spread 2 days later to the northern rivers of New South Wales. And the tenor of the conversation that day when we met in Brisbane, I put three questions to the group here. And some of you may remember them. Is that given the size and the scale and the intensity of the events that we're having, were our arrangements, our understanding of risk, and what we had in place enough to cope with disasters and events of that particular scale and magnitude? And was really the whole notion that community-led recovery is a realistic notion? Given you have this contest between a highly centralised, programmatic approach to recovery, where it's all coordinated by the state, where we have off-the-shelf recovery and relief packages, where our response arrangements are clearly articulated and the capabilities designed about historical appreciation of what we may have experienced? Or do we be a little more adventurous? Do we go down the path of a citizen-centric approach to recovery, where people whose values and what they prioritise are actually prioritised by us who sit in government and resourced accordingly? But in doing that, are we prepared to accept the trade-off, what I call the implementation gap, that it actually takes for communities to come together and organise themselves so that they can clearly articulate what their priorities are? And these are some of the key challenges that we face. And when we start to talk about locally led recovery, I continue to ask the question across all the communities I visit is, how do you wish to manage this? Do you want to wait the 4 and 5 and 6 months, and you know how unforgiving communities and the media and our leadership can be in that space? So they were some of the questions that we posed the audience back then. And then also the whole notion of, do we use this opportunity to build resilience and reduce risk and make this community stronger into the future? And importantly, what do we do to actually make that community stronger and safer for the future? Do we calibrate it and resource it on the event that has just passed? Or do we actually engage with that community prior to the event to get an understanding of what's of value to them and what do they want to build on? But importantly for us as a group, for us in government, for the research community, for the private sector, is how do we clearly articulate what the future might look like so that we can actually start to prepare, invest and plan for what that future could be, rather than looking out the rear vision mirror to what's just happened. And so it was a pretty vigorous discussion. I remember that pretty well that day. And Ellie Bird from Lismore carried it beautifully at the end when she made a really, really strong case that day for community-led recovery gives us the best outcome. And we should be looking at our role in here as we amplify the needs and the voices of those who don't have a voice in recovery. And they were very, very powerful messages that day. And as we fast forward 8 months, I think they still resonate with us here today as much and as strongly and as loudly as we heard 8 months ago. And can I suggest even, and I see Dominique's in the crowd and I see many other people who have been involved in the response space, as it did in 2019 after the bushfires. So I think the numbers are compelling. We've been through our third La Nina. We've had thousands upon thousands of homes inundated by considerably, as I said earlier, considerably larger floods than anyone had experienced before, and the nature of the events have been so quick and so intense, they've challenged all of our arrangements, both in response and recovery, and our thinking about how we manage risk into the future. And we've seen repeat events in northwest Queensland, Western New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Tasmania, Western Australia. And I've not seen it like this before, where the whole of the nation is essentially in this permanent state of response and recovery. And I think we need to go back a long time since we've seen that before. And at the same time, we are resourcing efforts to support New Zealand, Turkey bush earthquakes, events in the South Pacific. So how is it that we recalibrate the system so that we just don't look at it from our issues that we're facing today from a jurisdictional perspective, that rather we transition it to this global system perspective? And really, that's where we need assistance from those who join us here today. What I want to do today is just reflect on 3 key themes that we have heard in the last 8 months as we've moved amongst those communities across Australia. And what has been remarkable for us has been the consistency of those themes. The first one, and I think this will resonate with everyone because it is consistent across many, many events. We did not know what was coming. We didn't expect it to get that high. And whether you're a community in Goodna, Lismore, Yagara, Rochester, the River Murray, or if you're in Fitzroy River Crossing, where we were 3 or 4 months ago, the events that those communities experienced were far beyond the lived experience of many in those communities. And what was interesting too is in the last couple of months, we've seen our most vulnerable, our most isolated communities that have been impacted by significant disasters which, as I say, have exceeded all of their memories. And so the question is, how do we prepare for those scenarios? Because that is certainly the future that faces us, whether it's flooding, whether it's cyclones, and we had a Cat 5 just a couple of weeks ago crossed, luckily, a fairly sparsely populated part of the Western Australian coast. And that message that we received all the way through that was people weren't aware. Now, in these particular situations, there's been a lot of commentary, there have been a number of reviews done, which point to the adequacy of our warning systems. But I think we can just blame it all on technology. Do we have enough? Do our gauging stations, for example, give us enough information? What is the maintenance regime there? Are they fit for purpose given the scale and the intensity of these? The nature of the events actually have changed as well. We have a gauging system and a warning system that's calibrated for riverine flooding. But I think for every one of you who experienced or were in any of those events, this was significantly an overland flow event on top of a riverine flood event. So how is it that we now start to rethink our systems that actually inform how we deal with risk? It's also about maintenance, and it's about resourcing. Resourcing those people that we expect to maintain the system. And some of the other key learnings is that there have been flood studies, there is flood modelling available. But how old are those flood studies and flood modelling? Who's keeping their finger on the pulse in terms of how ready is the system to deal with some of the challenges we face into the future? And this goes to the governance arrangements in all that we do. And what we're seeing now is there has been massive development on many of the catchments throughout Australia, and yet we're only just now starting to catch up with running new LiDAR across some of these catchments. So we really understand the behaviour of catchments to this new norm of very, very intense events and what it means for our communities who choose to live on those floodplains. And let's be honest here, we've been doing it for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And as Daniel touched on there, and one of the other key learnings I've picked up as I've moved through our communities, if you listen to the environment and you look at the signals it's telling you, maybe there's an early warning system for us that maybe we've been somewhat blind to in the past. But importantly, we cannot just rely on the fact that we can re-engineer our flood modelling, our warning systems, our messaging systems, if we don't take a whole of society approach and recognise that everyone must contribute to this. And when we start to look at the behaviour of people, is there a better way of communicating risk? Is there a better way of communicating warnings? And is there a better way that we can prepare our communities for what may lay ahead into the future? Be it flooding, be it cyclones, be it bushfire, be it any hazard. And probably one of the key statistics that stands out for me in this particular slide is that 4 out of 10 people still wait until there's an event coming, it's impending, or it's actually hit before they start preparing. And I think we've seen that during bushfires, we've seen that during the cyclones, and we've also seen it during the floods. So I think an important component of this comes back to this systems approach to all we are doing in this particular space. But also importantly, we need to understand that these attitudes towards risk, the agency that people actually have in dealing with some of the threats that they face is quite marked across Australia. And that's one of the big challenges that we have also in the space in which we operate, is one size doesn't fit all. We're an incredibly diverse nation made up of rural, remote, island, coastal, metropolitan communities. One solution that is applicable to a capital city is not necessarily applicable to, say, somewhere like Fitzroy River Crossing or our remote Aboriginal communities. And that's important we recalibrate the system to ensure that we can support them and also that they are resilient into the future. The second theme, and this is not meant to be critical or anything like that. This is just a reflection on what we see to hopefully sow the seeds for a more in-depth conversation, better planning, better resourcing, and better thinking about our future. Our current arrangements to deal with any of the natural perils that we face are currently very much jurisdictionally based, and I think we all recognise that. They are tried and tested over decades of investment, planning, and also actually delivering for our communities following some very large events. But the question that we have now is, given the size and the scale and the frequency and the intensity of the futures that we face, is it adequate to continue to follow that path of strong jurisdictional arrangements? And it's our view that we need to be taking, as I said up front here, a more holistic approach and start to build a national capability. We do not want to step into this space, this is the Commonwealth, and run it. But I think we need to have at the core, the centre of all we do now, is to be able to do this at a national level and to bring together the skill sets, the capabilities that exist and the expertise and the experience that exists in all of these jurisdictions, both in response and recovery and risk reduction, to start to take a national approach to this. And by virtue of the standing and our experiences, we then share some of those lessons globally. And we only met last week with the New Zealand Prime Minister, and as part of the conversation we were talking about this whole notion of risk reduction and resilience. And we were talking about some of the work we were doing in flood resilient homes, but it became really, really apparent to me that New Zealand are world leaders in terms of earthquake planning, resilient home solutions in an earthquake zone, and also that planned retreat conversation that needs to occur across the rest of, well, certainly in many places here in Australia. It has been a tale of two recoveries as well, is what we've seen in the last few months. Is that we have some jurisdictions, because if you look at the disaster recovery funding arrangements, there's this beautiful little clause in there that says states are best placed to determine the amount and the level of and the type of assistance that is available to their communities in the aftermath of an event. But what we're seeing as a result of that is there are quite marked differences in the accessibility and the equity in terms of how we support communities as they recover, but also as they manage risk into the future. And this is a challenge for us as a nation, is to let go there and start to make it more accessible to our communities. Have that important safety net, but at the core of it, give people the opportunity to manage risk as part of their recovery process, but also into the long term as well. We've managed to break our supply chain routes 3 times this year. North-South Railroad, East-West Railroad, and more recently in North-West and Western Australia into probably the largest mineral export sector in the country. And if you now look at the detour to get from, or to get services into North-West and Western Australia, the detour is somewhat north of 12,500 kilometres to support those communities, to support those industries in the Northwest. And the solution will probably be 2 years in the making. So it makes a big argument for a national approach. It's almost a betterment program for our supply chains, isn't it? And at the moment, what we are doing is at the micro level, we are looking at betterment, but really we need to lift this conversation. And surely COVID was enough of a trigger for us, is that we need to be starting to look at some of these big issues at a national scale. As I said a little while ago, it's been a tale of a couple of recoveries as well. Some states have chosen put it back in the same place, in the same way it was before the particular event. That way we can get it done quickly, we can get people back in their homes, we can reconnect businesses as quickly as possible. And then you have other jurisdictions which have taken the philosophical approach at every stage of recovery. We will deal with risk and we will attempt to reduce that risk and make this community more resilient into the future. And what you've seen betterment in infrastructure. And I know this is a widely held belief that you cannot do betterment in recovery and it's not supported by the disaster recovery funding arrangements. Well, it's been going on for a decade. There's a way of finding out how you can do it. And it's about getting smart people in the room in terms of design and delivery of what those solutions look like. Have we got the right people at the table? Big challenge for us all, especially in those remote areas of Australia where they do not have access to the thinking, the technical expertise and the ability to deliver core foundational pieces of infrastructure that are more resilient to a whole range of hazards into the future. We've seen the events of the last 12 months trigger a much needed conversation here in Australia about where we live and how we choose to build. One has been triggered by a 1 in 500 year event where the community thought they were protected by levees. The other has been triggered by a whole of catchment flood study, which then triggered a strategic flood management plan. One was reactionary and had to be. One was very much, had been a long time in embryonic condition, so that when the event happened, it was the trigger to actually facilitate a conversation with the community about where people live and how do we deal with risk in the landscape. And that was a big challenge for us, and it didn't go smoothly. But I think it's triggered a broader conversation that needs to be had in this country about cyclone risk, flood risk, and also bushfire risk. Is that how do we not only trigger those conversations, but what are the solutions? I was talking to the Mayor of the Innisfail, of Hinchinbrook a few weeks ago, and he put it into stark relief. Is that here we are in the middle of a building crisis, a homelessness crisis, supply chain issues. And he said the options for his community, and as you would know, Hinchinbrook, Ingham, for those who don't know, the river runs straight through the middle of town. You have two options. You can build your home up on a big slab, about 2 metres above the floodplain, about the 1% AEP, or you can put it on stilts. The slab option, $1,600 a square metre to deliver. Lifting it up, the old Queenslander, that actually can deal with heat stress as well as flood impacts, $3,600 a square metre to build that. They're the differentials that we need to look at. That's the sort of investment case that we now start to need to make. They're the short-term costs of implementation, but what are the long-term costs of resourcing response, resourcing recovery, resourcing the impacts to those communities and to those industries? But we've made a start, but it needs to be much more broad-based than this, and we're certainly looking at other communities about how they start this conversation and what's the best way of affecting it. So what are we doing about it? Core to our function now as the National Emergency Management Agency will be our second National Action Plan. And this is about a plan that is actually designed to carry the conversation forward. It's going to be deliberately calibrated so that it is ambitious, that it will catalyse action. It will make us a little uncomfortable about the decisions that we need to take into the future. But importantly, these decisions will need to be informed by the best data, the best information, the best understanding of what works in our particular community. Central to it, it needs to reduce risk, because this is the central component of safeguarding our communities, our economies and our environment. The complexity of catastrophic risk is going to continually put question marks over our current jurisdictional approach to managing disaster risk into the future. That will be central to the plan. And we've got to stop managing disasters and transition to starting to manage risk. And that will certainly be underpinned by the Disaster Ready Fund, $1 billion over the next 5 years, with co-contributions from states and local governments. But importantly, we've got to move away from this transactional knee-jerk response to events as we look at what the investment timeframe and projects look like, to a more short, medium and long-term approach. We need to take a phased approach for this, and I look to this community to inform what the medium and the long term looks like. We're also looking at how we fund recovery, how we fund response agencies in terms of capability, and importantly, how we fund risk reduction into the future. We're additionally, on top of that, looking at working more closely with the private sector, because it is something that we have not done well here in Australia. But if we look at most of our near neighbours who deal with catastrophic disaster risks, they also have very, very strong linkages and recognise the importance of the academic sector, the insurance sector, and more generally the private sector. And these are some of the core themes that have emerged now over the last 8 months, and this is the focus for us as an agency. We look forward to working very, very closely with you into the future, because I think you are an important and an essential part of the message and the program that we take forward. So I'm happy to take some questions now, having sown a couple of thoughts for you. Thanks very much.
Brennan, thank you very much for that great presentation for everybody. We've got a couple of Slido questions coming through here. Just while they're coming through, I think just to focus on your end message there, if you had a key messages for the audience, mainly about research and end-user partnerships, given the fact that your organisation is so vitally important in the nation to dictate the sort of national policy, and we need to be very mindful about government objectives when setting our own research priorities into the future as well. What would be your one message about how for researchers to connect with your organisation and industry more general? What advice would you give to them?
Well, certainly I would start by using, under our current jurisdictional arrangements, you need to work very, very closely with the states to start off with. But we recognise at the Commonwealth level that we need to bring together all elements of the community, including yourselves, in terms of determining what does the future look like here. Let's start to do some serious planning around what the future looks like and what we need to do to get ourselves in that position so that we can make the case for further investment and getting an understanding of what it looks like out the front windscreen, rather than keep on looking out of the in the rear vision mirror. Now, the second National Action Plan will speak to that. We will start to pull together a number of key fora, which will now give you the opportunity to have a voice at the table, along with the private sector, along with the emergency management sector, community leaders as well. And this will be the platform and the opportunity now to start making the case. We'll start to develop what the themes look like, and we'll start to develop what we need to invest in into the future.
Great, thanks, Brendan. And the Slido questions are coming through thick and fast now. So let's go to the first one here. Resilience can't be built by the emergency management sector alone. How do we better coordinate all sectors to build resilient practices into business as usual?
Great question, and I agree wholeheartedly. Whole of society approach. And what I have seen work both internationally but also here in Australia in some jurisdictions, in some parts of the country, is that we recognise the important convening power of government, but recognise that they need to have at the table all sectors. And what's been developed overseas, their approach to dealing with risk, is that they actually have regional mitigation plans that are informed by research, informed by risk professionals, but also our emergency management sector, and contributed by the private sector. So people actually identify what's of value to them, what's at risk, and what they need to do about it. And that informs investment into the long term. And it's something that is only just emerging here in Australia, is that engagement at that regional state level to start to define what's important and what the plan is for the future. And I think what we've seen through royal commissions, through many of the reviews here, is that our current approach needs to change from the knee-jerk reaction to an event to a more planned and targeted approach into the future. We know what we need to do, we've just got to stop talking about it and actually do it.
This is a question on the doing as well. What does a national capability look like, and how does NHRA best support national capability?
So, well, it depends on which sector you're talking about here. As I touched on during my conversation there is a lot of experience and expertise and capability that exists across the nation. There are really, really strong capabilities that are well exercised, well planned for, and delivered that support communities. But as these events become bigger, we need to start to drop some of the institutional barriers that actually inhibit us or delay us from actually starting to deal with some of the big events we deal with, both in response and also recovery. There are some clear jurisdictional issues that we're currently dealing with. You know, we've got all these cross-border issues. This is about starting to look at what are the outcomes we're seeking to achieve for our community, not does it fit in my plan or does it fit with my legislative responsibility.
We've got a question here that really relates to workforce capability as well, and you had that on one of your slides there too, Brendan. What's your thoughts there from sort of a national direction about how we build workforce capability across our country at all levels of government and across the broader resilience sector as well?
It's an interesting challenge that we have, and we have set our mind to it. You know, sort of we can just focus today on the natural hazard risk space. But I think if you do it in isolation from what's going on geopolitically, what's going on in supply chains around the world, then I think we shortchange ourselves a little bit. We've got to be open to what's going on around the place. It will demand different solutions. At the moment, we recognise that the use of the Australian Defence Force, for example, immediately after event one provides resources in which to assist a community, usually in the supply chain space. It gives them an inordinate amount of confidence because they know someone has their back. How do we transition to potentially a private sector model there? How do we use the big transport companies to solve our supply chain issues into some of these remote, vulnerable communities that have been impacted by event? This is a change in thinking, is that we let go of our old institutional arrangements and start to think, how do we engage more broadly? And once again, I keep saying it, we need the right people at the table and a willingness to be a part of the solution.
Great, and following Nima on social media, I know that you've been busy travelling around the country, and I know that you've been to various parts of Northern Australia where First Nations people have been heavily impacted by disasters, noting places like Fitzroy Crossing and Burketown most recently. How do you see Nima supporting First Nations leadership in disaster risk reduction?
I think Daniel put it perfectly, didn't he? Listen. You know, sort of, I remember being a part of the early collaboration and the early work of the second National Action Plan, and there was a lot of conversation about how do we use Indigenous knowledge to inform what we do in this particular space. And there was a lot of conversation about that. And I didn't really understand what elements do we need to incorporate in what we were doing. So I went away and I went up to the Cape, and for those of you who don't know, I come from Queensland. Our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples have local government areas themselves. They have a lot of agency in this space, and I spoke to one of the mayors, the mayors there in Lockhart River, and I said, what is this Indigenous knowledge that you talk about? What are the lessons I need to learn and listen to you about? And he told me about, for his people in the Lockhart River, one of the keys that they were picking up from the environment, when turtles were coming into nest, they knew everything was going to be okay for that particular wet season. But when the turtles didn't come into nest, they knew that there was going to be a big cyclone season and that they need to get prepared. And for all the challenges that we face in our space, remember that key theme that I mentioned earlier on, we didn't know what was coming. And it was that connection to environment, and that was learning the lessons of what the environment were telling people that informed their preparation, their planning and their response. And that was a key message for me, because then you can then articulate to all your colleagues in the disaster management, emergency management space and the rest of government, is that connection to country, those looking for the signals, is important in informing what you do now and into the future. But it doesn't need to be all environmental signals. And I think there's enough signals for us out in the wider environment now, is that we need to do things a little differently.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Brennan. We're at time now, but look, we're so grateful to have you here with us at the forum. You've come back to our second one as well. Hopefully we can invite you back to our third, and it becomes a frequent event to engage with you and your agency at our forums. It's really great to hear what the national priorities, what your thinking is for the future, because we as researchers and also our participating agencies from an industry and end user perspective really appreciate that, such that we know where we need to be shaping our priorities into the future as well. So very much appreciated, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Nicola Moore, and I'm one of the Node Research Managers with NHRA, based up in Brisbane, where I work with our stakeholder and researcher communities in Queensland and the Northern Territory. And this morning I have the honour of chairing the first session of our core research program presentations. Can I invite up to the stage Dr. Timothy Neale, Dr. Andrea Rawlook and Oliver Costello, please. It's just you? Thanks, Tim. We're moving into what we would call a rapid fire set in the program, which means that we've got a lot to cover in a really tight time frame. So we won't actually have time to take any questions from the audience during these sessions, but we've set up a Slido for you to post questions this morning. So please use the code on the screen, and it might be best as if you start your question with the name of the presenter, and they'll be able to answer them once they've finished their presentations. So I'll hand over to Timothy Neale from Deakin University to talk about cultural land management research and governance in South East Australia. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Andrea and Ollie are here, and they're going to be on a panel this afternoon, First Nations research yarn. But they said I could do this by myself, so I'll do that. I'm a non-Indigenous researcher from Deakin University, originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I thought the welcome this morning in smoking was just a beautiful reminder that so many of us, including myself, are guests here, uninvited guests on Wurundjeri country, and I'm so thankful for the acknowledgement and hospitality. There have been a couple of themes this morning, I think both in Daniel's welcome, but also in Brendan's presentation just now, that you'll see repeated across this presentation. Themes like about listening, about sharing knowledge, about letting go and doing things differently. And the presentation is about a project that we're just beginning, the team, but I also want to kind of give a little backstory about some of the research that we've done to get us there. And it does, as it says in the title, focus here in the southeast, where again, as Daniel was signalling, there are different histories that we need to kind of account for, and those different histories inflect what happens when traditional owner groups, Indigenous peoples, government agencies or researchers all seek to come together and collaborate. So, with that said, who are we and why are we talking about this? Well, as I said, several different kind of research projects that have gone into this that Ollie and I have been involved in particular over the last 4 or 5 years that lead up to this new project funded by the NHRA. For me, it's very clear that kind of these numbers of partnerships and collaborations between Indigenous groups and non-Indigenous institutions like research agencies, like land management agencies, like emergency management agencies, they're growing very rapidly in number and scope. You know, if we just look at some of the kind of funding announcements that we've seen since the 1920 bushfire season, or things that, you know, really over the past 5 years to 10 years here in southeastern Australia, these partnerships and collaborations are growing rapidly, which is fantastic, but also creates all kinds of issues and obstacles for those who want to sustain those. They are two-way. Something I get asked periodically is, Tim, you know, as a non-Indigenous person, why do you do this kind of research? And it's from a kind of fundamental understanding that it's not just up to Indigenous peoples to tell non-Indigenous peoples what to do. Like, we have to come to the party, we have to contribute, we can't just passively wait for things to change. We have an active responsibility to participate. And fourth, as some of this research has very much demonstrated, people of goodwill are really looking for a lot of guidance around what to do. Around how to respond to the opportunities to have partnerships. And then once you have them running, how to keep them going. So these are kind of the four background, I guess, the whys. There are many pathways to collaboration, and this is something I like to try and remind people of, is we kind of think of collaborations, between intercultural collaborations between traditional owner groups and others as necessarily good, but we don't often talk about why we do them. That actually there are a number of different motivations, there are a number of different ways in which collaborations start, and this is something that we've over the years attempted to map and kind of think about, well, for each of these, what are the drivers? Because in some situations, you know, there is a legal responsibility for agencies, government agencies, to work with traditional owner groups. But that's not actually universally the case, thanks to the shortcomings of land rights. So I just like to put that up to just kind of get in people's heads, minds, I should say, that there are many different pathways. This previous project that Ollie and I and many others were involved in really looked at these emerging collaborations, particularly around cultural fire management, going and spending lots of time interviewing people, going to cultural burns, and trying to understand what are the drivers of successful collaborations that were emerging in that space. And what are some of the obstacles? And I guess one of the kind of ones that really stood out over and over was that there's really still a very low familiarity between traditional owners and agencies, that these are parties who, here in the southeast, have not had much to do with each other historically. People don't know one another. They don't know quite where to start. So where things do start, there's often a really heavy reliance on personal trust to get those partnerships going. There are many obstacles. I could probably do a whole presentation on the obstacles to centering country and First Peoples, but I guess one of the kind of headline ones would be to say, and I think Brendan's presentation kind of pointed to this in thinking about community-led recovery, is that agencies are very set in their ways, right? In part, agencies are there to be relied upon in a crisis, and so they have very set processes, very set guidelines, and so therefore it can be very hard to give up any kind of power, particularly kind of procedural power, to others. And so therefore there's a need to reform the administration and regulation of fire use in particular, or land use we could say more generally. And I think the fifth point is a particularly interesting one because it's an ongoing challenge of, well, once you have a collaboration, you have, let's say, a cultural fire program going, or you have some kind of shared governance, how do you create accountability? And how do you actually know, how do you monitor that you're doing well? And this is a kind of ongoing challenge because, again, agencies, researchers like myself, the outputs and outcomes by which we are governed and rewarded are not those of country, nor are they necessarily those of traditional owner groups. So out of that, we call it kind of key enablers. Obviously, interpersonal trust is a huge one, because collaboration and partnerships, can go through bumpy times. And then a bunch of other things, I guess. But the ones that stand out to me are these kind of, that are very important, are these kind of process and governance issues. And this was something that came up again and again through that project. It's not just a matter of having project funding, we're going to do something interesting for a couple of years. How do we change our processes so this becomes, as I said at the end there, business as usual? This is a kind of key enabler. And out of all of those, how does it therefore build capacity for Indigenous peoples to engage with land management, right? That we're not just looking to, we, researchers, government agencies, are not just looking to Indigenous peoples to tell us what they know, but actually that we're building their capacity to do it on their own and actually take over stuff eventually. So a project that came out of that project, funded by the BNHCRC, was trying to turn some of this into principles for collaboration. And so over the last couple of years, we held a series of workshops, this was in 2021, and thought about this in order to come up with some kind of principles for working this stuff through. So you can get that from the BNHCRC website. But it comes down to thinking again about kind of mechanisms of change. And what we did was we mapped those that are kind of external to agencies and those that are internal to them. So things that drive change are things like whole of government reforms, like here in Victoria, you could say like self-determination reforms that government agencies kind of have to do. They didn't come up with it. Legislative and regulatory changes, so we could think of things like the creation of the Traditional Owner Settlement Act here in Victoria. Post-event inquiries, obviously, major driver of change. And public expectations. I think that's been a really massive one in relationship to thinking about cultural fire, for example, that there's a lot of public interest in cultural fire that has therefore pushed others within government to respond to that. And then First Nations governance, obviously. So that led us to a number of potential levers for agencies to think about, and as well as, therefore, what is within the power of agencies to work on. And those are things, as we've seen, that are very important, like having demonstration cases, having personal investment because of the need to go above and beyond, the need to change regulations, the need potentially to take on risk. If you're a senior government person. Resourcing, again, something that agencies have some control over, and thinking about, mentoring, building capability, building that workforce, and creating opportunities for network and exchange. So again, this was a project that's, again, in this space, like people wanting guidance, how do we do this in a way that's going to actually be helpful across a number of different contexts. Which brings us to the new project, which we've just recently started, which is called Cultural Land Management, Research and Governance in Southeastern Australia. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a tidy acronym. Each time we have a new project, I want to have like one of those beautiful acronyms that people will just remember, but it didn't work out in this case. So this new project is again working in this kind of similar kind of space where really what there is a need for is more of this work to think about what are kind of some of the, not just the principles, which are great, people can kind of grasp those in the abstract, but then building those out from the existing literature to think about, well, therefore, if we have this principle, what does it look like to put that into practice? And again, give people try and give people a bit more guidance as they go about this work. And what we're going to do is hold a number of workshops with the kind of relevant parties, traditional owner groups, research organisations, government land management agencies, to not only, I guess, go over this work and develop these principles, but also, you know, thinking about those earlier projects, actually use workshops to build relationships, either where they already exist, sustain them, or where they are emerging, really try and support them. And so that's the research team and also our project steering group. Jack Pascoe is here today. He's kindly going to chair this afternoon's panel, so look out for that. The first kind of outcome of this is that we have developed up some principles and protocols, which will be available very soon from the Natural Hazards website. But just to give you, I guess, a little bit of a taste, these are the principles that we've come up with from the literature and from talking to our project steering group. And we've developed those up into, as I've said, a bit of a kind of a one-pager, which as we write on the one-pager is really just kind of a start. Well, it's here as to help people start a conversation. There's a bigger, longer document that people can go and read as well, but we realize that often people are looking for just like an initial bit of guidance, initial bit of steering, and then they can go and dig into the appendix on their own time. So that'll be out very soon, and we're quite excited about that. And it'll be announced. So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for your attention, and we're looking forward to sharing results from this project in future forums. Okay, take my pen.
Thank you, Tim. It does seem quite strange not to take questions. I feel quite uncomfortable about not being able to field questions, but please pop them in Slido if you want to catch them. And also this afternoon at the yarning session, some of those questions can be used then as well. Can I please invite Liza Gelt from Collaborative Consulting, Carla Mooney, Dr. Paul Fox-Hughes and Dr. Wendy Sharples to the stage, please. Thank you. You're first, Liza. You're first, yep. So our next set of presentations, we're getting a bit faster now. This is the rapid fire round. Quick 5-minute sessions to give you a taste of the range of work underway in the Centre's program. And for those of you in the room, you can also use these sessions to determine your interest, I suppose, in the workshops that we'll be running tomorrow. Again, questions on Slido. Please start with the name of the presenter so that they can respond. So first up is Liza Gelt from Collaborative Consulting, talking about the project Severe Weather Impact Prediction. Thank you. That's a good question. There it is. Oh, yeah. Oops, don't drop it.
Morning, welcome. I'm Liza Gelt, and today I'd like to introduce the project to you about severe weather impact prediction and sector partner engagement project, and also encourage you to come to our workshop, our interactive session tomorrow. So by sector partners, we're talking about sector partners for severe weather. So we're talking about the SESs of Australia, we're talking about those departments with emergency service responsibilities like QFES and DFES in WA and Queensland. By severe weather, we're really looking at large-scale winds and severe thunderstorm. So cyclones and floods are a bit broader than what we're looking at, and we're really interested in what our sector partners need to know to inform their decision-making in their planning, their preparedness and their response to severe weather. And we want to mitigate the impact of those severe weather events. So we want to understand the types of information they need to know, what format they'd like that information, and how they want to essentially ingest this leading scientific capability that we have in Geoscience Australia and the Bureau of Meteorology to be really, relevant, useful, and accessible. So when we're talking about this project, we've adopted the risk triangle because it's familiar to everyone. And so we have our hazards down the bottom. So we have our large-scale winds and we have our severe thunderstorms, which includes rain, hail and wind. We have our exposure, which is location-based asset information that Geoscience Australia has. And we also have our vulnerability information, and that's stored in databases which contains characteristics around buildings. So we're talking about building age, we're talking about building materials. Now, when we understand that the risk is almost certain, so we know the path of the storm and we know where it's heading, we can start to talk about impact. And Geoscience Australia has the National Hazard we call it NHIRS, Natural Hazards Impact and Risk Service. And what this project really wants to understand, and NHIRS provides you with a map and it has the damage states and colour codes, but we really want to understand what our response agencies want, how they want to be communicated to so they can best ingest that information. So I'm just going to flick through to the project team, because what we really want you to do over the next couple of days is come up and talk to us and tell us how we can, best design this project. This research forum has coincided with the start of this research project, so we need to frame our design around what is truly needed by our response agencies. So we've got Dr. Kat Haynes from the Centre, we've got Craig Arthur from Geoscience Australia. He'll be giving a small demonstration of NHIRS with the map-based technology and layering on how the impact looks and what the damage states will look like. We've got Harold Richter from the Bureau of Meteorology here, and myself, I'll be leading the delivery team. And we'll be and the delivery team, we've got Dr. Michael Rumsevich, who's in the audience today. We've got Rosie Tran, and we've also, and in our back pockets, we've also got Dr. Mark Haynes and Andrew Stark. It's just to make sure that we're keeping our research straight. So tomorrow, I encourage you to come along. We're in stream 3. It's the first 50 through the door. And we're after morning tea, so we're at 11:30. So please get involved. Please come and tell us what you'd like to hear. Thank you.
Everyone, this is Dr. Carla Mooney from the Bureau of Meteorology, talking about flash flood case studies to improve predictions and the communication of uncertainty. Just there, yeah. And there's your little controller.
Okay. Thanks very much. And there's the timer. Okay, thanks very much. So I'm going to be talking about a new project which is about improving predictions and the communication of uncertainty. And the next few minutes I'm going to try and talk about 3 things: why it's an important project, the scope of the project and something about what we want to get out of it. And the last thing is a little bit about the method or the approach we're going to use. So, finding this difficult. Why is it important? Well, flash flooding is a significant hazard in the world and in Australia, and BNHCRC previously did some research about fatalities from flooding, and flooding came out as second as the most deadly hazard that we have. The actual number of people who are killed from flash flooding is a little bit more difficult to determine, but we know it's a really significant hazard, and just can think to this last year with a significant flash flood, for example, in Eugowra in New South Wales, where 2 people tragically lost their lives. There's also the significant disruption that occurs, particularly in urban areas, and the picture there shows a big flash flood that took place in Melbourne last year. Thanks to the Herald Sun that we've got that photo, and it just shows just how unexpected and sudden sometimes these hazards are that impact what people want to do. I think the big thing, and that's why we're focusing on prediction, is that it's difficult to predict the location at times, the timing and intensity of the rainfall that leads to the flash flooding, and local topographic factors really influence what actually happens on the ground when the water hits the ground. There's a few questions in here that you might want to remember if you're going to come to our workshop tomorrow, because one thing to maybe think about is what is the definition of flash flooding, and the Bureau uses a definition that flash flooding is flooding that occurs within 6 hours of rainfall, and it's one that's used more broadly as well. So what we're going to be doing in this case studies is actually sort of looking to understand the problem. The project goes for a year, and it's an interdisciplinary project that's bringing together social science with meteorology, hydrology, and with emergency service partners and all their disaster management expertise. And we're going to be looking at, to focus on the end-to-end warning chain, and that's why I've got the total warning system up there, because this project is trying to look from the beginning, from the production of knowledge all the way through to the communication about the warnings and human behaviour and response. What I also want to point out is that it's a very, very deeply partnershiped approach in flooding, and particularly flash flooding, where the Bureau issues warnings for severe weather warnings for conditions likely to lead to flash flooding, and the agencies and response partners issue warnings specifically for flash flooding if they do. So it's really important to understand that it's a really joined up process. This project was identified as a priority in a workshop last year held by NHRA. And so it is something that we're working on with our partners in a collaborative way. So just to go to the method, we're actually using for our case studies a method called the value chain method. And this is based on a project that's been developed in an international collaboration, actually, which trying to look at the production, communication and use of weather information across the whole timescale. So it helps us shift from thinking about a particular aspect of a problem to be looking at the whole value chain of production and use of that information and the impact it has, and the social and environmental institutional factors that affect how people are able to respond to the information. Particularly, we're looking at a survey as well, which is going to be really trying to inquire into how people understand uncertainty, how they understand flash flood risk, and how we can improve the communication of that. And there's 3 places where that information is significantly communicated, and that's between, for example, the Bureau and our partners and the media when we announce this sort of severe weather events, between then the emergency services and local councils and responders, and then to the community. And at each point, there's an issue around how people communicate and understand risk. And, I've gone the wrong way. So the call out is if anyone would like to talk about it more, we'd love to talk about it. We're looking for case studies and people to support us with the dissemination of the survey and information to support the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And here's Dr. Paul Fox-Hughes, also from the Bureau, talking about developing an integrated predictive capability for extreme rainfall and inundation.
Thanks, Nicola. I've actually got it easy because Carla's done all the heavy lifting for me. The 2 projects, the project I'm talking about, the project that Carla has just talked about, are quite linked, and so we'll be using the sorts of information that are gained from that project in ours. Now, forecasting the weather is difficult. I've been doing it for a long time, on and off, and I know. Sometimes we do it well, sometimes we don't. And it's particularly difficult when we're looking at high impact weather, things that cause destructive impacts, and particularly with precipitation, with rainfall. There are all sorts of processes going on all sorts of scales that interact to make our life as forecasters difficult. And so it's really important that we are able to characterise the uncertainty that attends to these sorts of events. And that's been a focus of national weather services and emergency agencies for a couple of decades now, and increasingly so in Australia. And this project wants to leverage the millions of dollars of investment the Australian government, the community has made in trying to characterise the uncertainty in these sorts of events and to communicate that uncertainty well and clearly to communities. So that's what we're all about. And hopefully I might even get a slide to go forward. Should I be pointing this in a particular direction? No. Oh, okay, thank you. Oh, okay, thank you. So what we're hoping to do, as I said, is to optimise the use and communication of probabilistic environmental information to emergency agencies and to communities. And there's a team of us from a diverse group of specialties within the Bureau to try and do that. You beauty. So there are several components to what we're going to do. The first of them is to look at high resolution ensembles, the sort of thing that I was talking about a second ago, to give an indication days to hours out of what sort of event might happen, and importantly again what the uncertainty might be. Then as we get to hours to minutes to it's happening now, using radar nowcasting to better characterise probabilistically what's going on. And then Wendy's part of the project will be to take all of that information and say, okay, what does that mean on the ground? What is the implications in terms of the likelihood, the probabilistic inundation? Brendan referred earlier to not just riverine flooding, but flash flooding or land area flooding. That's our focus. We're not looking so much at riverine, but flash flooding over land areas. So we want to integrate all of these to decrease, if you like, the cognitive overload that forecasters and emergency management have in trying to work out what's going on during these sorts of events. So it's really, as I said, the optimal use of high-resolution numerical weather ensembles. There are a whole range of things that we could look at that we want to address to help forecasters better integrate this information. Then we want to, as I said, use the rainfall radar information to better say what's happening now and what's likely to happen in the next hour or so, and integrate that into modelling inundation. And over the top of all of that is the framework of the value chain that Carla referred to pass that information clearly and succinctly to emergency management and to users across the board. So please join with us when we have the workshops tomorrow. And I can't get the thing to work again.
Thank you. And everyone, this is Dr. Wendy Sharples, who's talking to you about the long-range flood outlook for strategic preparedness. Wendy, we've added your Slido questions to a special Slido page at the end, so it'll be on your slides.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to give a brief snapshot of the long-range flood outlook project, and hopefully I can work the slides. Yes, I can. Great. So the main motivation for this project was in talking to emergency management and decision support gurus. They were telling us what we'd really like is a flood outlook that's like the bushfire outlook. Wouldn't that be great? And so we're like, oh, that's a very good idea. And we looked at the current offerings, and there are a few products, but they're a little bit disparate and they haven't really been brought together for that really nice outlook, such as the bushfire one that we have currently. So we're using the latest technology to generate these outlook products on an ensemble probabilistic approach to get a spatial product, which is a probabilistic inundation product, and also a probability of exceedance along the river regions as well. And the other thing that we're doing is looking at what other agencies are offering in terms of a long-range flood outlook, such as NOAA and in the US Met Service, and bringing those together to try and get a product that is user-friendly, that SES and decision support gurus can use easily and interpret, and we're doing this in testbed areas. So as my very esteemed colleagues talked before, we're leveraging a lot of their amazing work in their other projects, the heavy rainfall and also the communication projects, to provide, hopefully, optimal value. And I was a bit sneaky. I know that Nicola said that there was no questions, but I've actually put in a Slido package some prompts there, and we would really, really like your input to make this project a real success for NHRA and also for Australians. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everybody. Your duty for today is now finished, and you are welcome to retire from the stage. And as they leave, again, please, folks, put your questions in Slido. I think I'm not sure how many are in there now. I saw one, but it'd be great to have your questions in there. And think about coming along to the relevant workshops tomorrow. I'd really like to introduce you to three very special people. I don't know where they are, but I'd like to ask Rebecca Ryan from Wollongong University up to the stage, Nina Rogers from the University of Tasmania, and Kate Simmons from the University of Melbourne. These are three of our the Centre's PhD students, and they're going to do even more rapid presentations, 3-minute presentations on their projects. Again, no time for questions, but please ask them some questions in Slido. We actually, just as a bit of an intro, we actually had student presentations in a student day at the forum last year, and they were so good. That's why we wanted to integrate them into the big program for this time around. So, Rebecca, thank you. Just point it in that
direction. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today and also on which my study sites are located. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So during the 2019-20 Black Summer bushfires, we often heard this word unprecedented. But in actual fact, our existing records don't paint an accurate picture of past fire severity and intensity for us to be able to make these conclusions with such confidence. Our existing records largely rely on remote sensing data from satellites, which only gives us about a 30 to 50 year record. Beyond that, we rely on charcoal and analysis of tree rings, which can tell us a bit about fire occurrence, but not necessarily fire characteristics like severity and intensity. In order to more accurately forecast future fire events, we really need at least a 100-year record, and that's where my project comes in. So I'm looking at boron isotopes and Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, or FTIR, as novel proxies for modelling past bushfires. For those that are less familiar with boron, that's okay. It's an essential micronutrient for plants and forms a key role in, among other things, cell wall formation and sugar transport. But what we're most interested in is its fractionation in plant species. So typically we say that the roots are isotopically lighter, so they're enriched in the lighter isotope, whilst the leaves are enriched in the heavier isotope 11b, and there's a gradient in between. So when we're seeing fires of different severity and different levels of the canopy are being consumed, we're going to get a different deposition into our sediment record, and we're going to have an isotopic signature that we can then associate with high severity fires. FTIR, on the other hand, analyses changes in chemical bonds using the unique interactions with infrared light. So again, during a typical bushfire, we tend to see changes in temperature and pH, which will change the chemistry of the soil. So the first aim of my project was to look at these against a fire of known severity, and we've done that. So the next year of my project will be looking at the Blue Mountains, which is the map on the left-hand side here, and we've collected samples from a range of fire return intervals to determine the resolution of these proxies. We'll then apply them to Namadgi National Park, which is the map on the right, to create a more long-term record. That's me. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. Nina?
Hi, so I'm Nina Rogers with the University of Tasmania, and my PhD is exploring leadership for local government climate change adaptation. I start with the premise that local government has a really critical role to play in adaptation in terms of building resilience into their own infrastructure, service delivery and operations, but also supporting community resilience to a changing climate. Across Australia, there's a large number of councils who are undertaking climate change risk and vulnerability assessments and the development of adaptation plans. However, councils face major hurdles in being able to move from the planning to implementation of their intended climate change responses. Now, the established literature points to two key factors that lead to this implementation gap. The first being limited institutional capacity, but also absent or ineffective political leadership. While this literature actively explores issues of capacity, to date, very few studies have actually looked at deeply seeking to understand the role and the influence of council leaders on how climate risk travels through the policy process in their organisations. And this is where my research seeks to respond to this imbalance. So I will look at what is that role and influence of local government executive and elected leaders on climate change risk planning and the mainstreaming of adaptation responses across their organisations. To achieve this, I'm using qualitative research methods for both my data collection and analysis, and I've completed 25 in-depth interviews with local government leaders, seeking to ask them about their understanding of climate-related risk, the role that they see for their organisations in responding, and so forth. By way of next steps, my literature review has been accepted for publication, so pretty pleased about that. And my next goal is to ensure that my interview data can also be visible in that scholarly audience through journals. But I'm really keen to ensure that there's a range of communication products that speak to practitioners and policymakers across jurisdictions, but with a focus on working with that local level. I think there's enormous opportunity to extend our understanding of the complexities of decision-making and issue prioritisation in councils, and hopefully my research will contribute to that understanding. And it's through that knowledge that we can seek to identify how, in a very practical sense, collaboratively in that multi-level governance framework, we can support increased community-level resilience and adaptation through the local level. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. And now Kate Simmons from the University of Melbourne. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. So today I'm going to very briefly talk about using long-term logging experiments to investigate the resilience of cool temperate rainforests to disturbance and to climate change. So forests are dynamic ecosystems that are impacted by a variety of different factors over different timescales. This makes investigating the impacts of large-scale changes, like climate change, very challenging and requires long data sets. Unfortunately, very few of these exist in Australia. An alternative and underutilised resource is long-term logging experiments, such as those that were established by the State Forestry Commissions of New South Wales and Victoria in the 1950s and to 1970s. These were generally established to assess the impacts of different severities of logging on the growth of commercially valuable timber species. However, now we can use these to gain insights into how these forests respond to disturbance over long time periods. For my PhD, I'm using 3 experiments that were established in the 1960s in cool temperate rainforest stands in Wili and Werrikimbe National Parks near Port Macquarie in New South Wales. These experiments cover over 50 years and have measurements of over 2,000 tree species of 31 different species. Temperate rainforests are particularly interesting in this context because they're generally considered as being sensitive to and usually free of disturbance, and in particular fire. Despite this, however, there are records of 7 historic fires in the area that I'm focusing on since 1915, including the 2019 and 2020 bushfire season. Due to this and concerns that climate change may favour warm temperate species over cool temperate species, Nothofagus morai, which is the sort of flagstone flagship species of the area, was listed as vulnerable in 2018. However, we can use these experiments to look at how this species and other species grow post-disturbance. And so that's what the image that I've got on the slide is the green is the Nothofagus, and then the other 2 colours are 2 species of concern. And what we can see is 50 years post-disturbance, the Nothofagus grows much more quickly than the other 2 species across all of the areas that have been logged. This kind of data can also be used to characterise post-disturbance mortality as well as regeneration over long time periods, and should be considered in other forests where this kind of data is available. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate, and all of you can take a deep breath now, and you're welcome to leave the stage. Give them a hand, everyone. This is great. The Centre's really pleased to be supporting these students in their projects. And can I invite Megan and Lisa to the stage, please? I'm really pleased to introduce you to Megan Considine and Associate Professor Lisa Slater to present on Healing Country through I knew this would happen, my apologies. Wurundjeri and Wiradjuri-led management. This is another one of our First Nations-led research projects. Thank you. Thank you. Just point it in that direction.
Hi, everyone. And I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners on this land we meet, and also Waggaloo Wiradjuri country of Brungle-Tumut are the lands on which this project is taking place. So after I also just wanted to thank Tim and Ollie and Andrea for that fantastic work, and I was like, great. So after the 2019-2020 fires, we established a collaboration between Waggaloo Wiradjuri community of Brungle-Tumut, the local land council, the University of Wollongong, and scientists from the Department of Planning and Environment, DPE. So the regional project was designed to reconnect the Waggaloo Wiradjuri community to a critically endangered species of cultural and ecological importance, the crobbery frog, who Waggaloo call Gaiac. So since the beginning in 2020, the project has developed and deepened, and the crobbery frog is just one really important part of a puzzle to revitalise Waggaloo Wiradjuri knowledges and work to put culture at the centre of land management practices. So after the fires, I think as many of you would know, the Natural Resource Management Agencies, NRM agencies, committed considerable resources to recovery, which included investments in First Nations cultural land management practices. So this reflects the growing awareness within government and non-government agencies that First Nations people are key stakeholders, or actually fundamentally key to the protection of their traditional lands. So working with NRM agencies is often an opportunity for First Nations people to connect with their country and revive important cultural practices to support resilient ecological systems. So while this is a really positive shift in NRM agencies, there's, as Tim talked about, there's typically a lack of communication between these different agencies and associated projects. And there's increasing pressure on a few community members to accommodate these projects around their already busy lives. Secondly, however inadvertently, agency approaches often avoid the reality of dispossession by assuming that First Nations people have been able to maintain their knowledge and connections to country, which avoids the difficult truth of ongoing colonialism. So to address the first problem, with funding from the Cultural Fire Management Unit and UOW, we created a Wiradjuri position that is responsible for promoting, coordinating and managing NRM projects. And we call that the Cultural NRM Officer, and Megan is in the female role of that, and Brad Freeman is in the male position. And we call this Bungle-Wumble, and it's created employment and puts people on country and enhances the capacity for Wiradjuri to speak for their country. And Megan's going to talk a little bit more about that, and we'll also show you a short film. So our new project is built on these really strong foundations, and I just want to give you a quick overview. The driver from government to engage Aboriginal community is good, but where is the support to ensure that this leads to healthy relationships that do not reinforce power imbalances, but rather enable Aboriginal leadership of the NRM agenda? First Nations people have long maintained that revitalising connection to country is the foundation for developing healthy country and healthy relationships between Aboriginal peoples and NRM agencies. So at the foremost, this requires Wiradjuri revitalising and sharing their cultural knowledge within their community, and then collectively deciding how they want to care for country now. So our project seeks to run on-country activities to revitalise and share Wiradjuri cultural knowledge, and Megan's going to discuss this. And another key objective is for Wiradjuri to tell their stories of their region's history, their country, and the project itself. So through the rekindling and strengthening of Wiradjuri connections to country, cultural knowledges and intergenerational knowledge exchange, our objective is to better understand what Wiradjuri caring for country looks like today, and how NRM agencies can support this and allow Wiradjuri to be effective custodians of their country. And we're just going to show a short film now.
Alrighty, so hi everyone, my name's Megan. I'm a Wiradjuri Waggaloo woman from Tumut. I would like to acknowledge the Kulin Nations and thank Daniel for welcoming us here today to Wurundjeri country. So I am the female lead in our natural resource management project that we're running down in Tumut. Oh, we've missed the first slide.
Ooh, that's...
So I'm just going to quickly talk about the projects that we've been doing since August last year. We started off with some native re-veg, and this actually is we've done some trout cod release, corroboree frog release into enclosures. Corroboree frog's quite a big part of our project. And then to the next one. And then we've also done some cultural burns. A lot of our project is around getting our young people this knowledge that our old people have. Sorry, this is my first time in Melbourne and my first forum, so I'm a little bit not great at this right now. So yeah, our project, we've had native re-veg, we've done some endangered species monitoring and protection. We've done our cultural burns. This is at Brungle, and most recently If we go to the next slide, we've started on some workshops. We've done some native tree identification, native tree, like I said, tree veg, and we've started learning about the native bee, because we got hit pretty hard, obviously, in the bushfires down at Blowering, and our community wanted to know what sort of effect native bees had, how they'd been affected, and we don't actually know, because there's no research down there regarding that. So we're going to launch into that this year. And over here, this is actually our corroboree frog enclosures. We've got, I think, 3 locations. And we met the minister, actually. She's come up to hear about our story. Obviously, Guyak's a big part of our story. And I think somebody touched on it earlier, how he talked about the turtles and how if they came, we were safe. If they didn't, it's similar. Our story with Gaiak is if he called out to us, we were allowed to pass through country. So our stories for Aboriginal people have a lot to do with where we move in country, how we do things. All this goes to say, through this project and community engagement, we've identified that the gap that we need to hit is that there isn't enough knowledge there is knowledge in our community, but not shared enough. And the hope of this project is to keep going, moving forward, managing country together with NRM agencies, but also learning. I found that this project I've had more conversations with community members, even with my pop and my mum, about old stories, which I probably wouldn't have had 12 months ago. I was working in construction, and then I moved on to this position, and those are the sort of conversations that we need to have as a community to get our people confident, our community confident, to say this is how we want to manage land. Like, we feel like it is within us, but we don't have the confidence to say it just yet. So our hope is to keep moving forward and working together to build that confidence and knowledge. Because if we take care of country, she's going to take care of us.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you both. That was a brilliant presentation, and a wonderful presentation to wrap up our morning sessions. Again, if you've got any questions for Megan and Lisa, please put them on Slido, but alternatively, you can offer them up in the yarning session this afternoon as well. So everybody, you'd be pleased to learn you've made it through the morning session, and morning tea is out in the foyer. Thank you very much for your participation this morning, and enjoy your refreshment break. We'll be back here by 11 sharp, please, to start the next rapid fire presentations. Thank you, everyone.